It's the Larry Kudlow Show. Free market prosperity starts here. Now, here's Larry Kudlow.
So is inflation dead? Is the Fed going to cut interest rates? And what are the politics of an election year interest rate cut? We bring in our great friend John Carney, Breitbart News economics editor and co-author of the Breitbart Business Digest. Thank you, John. Interestingly, I didn't pay enough attention to the Producer Price Index, which was out, Thursday?
Friday,
yesterday. And actually, it was a lot worse than I realized, because I was reading your digest. Inflation also rises. And tell us about it. You picked up a couple of very nasty trends.
Yeah, so we got a very soft consumer price index, and that's what everybody focused on this week. But the very next day, on Friday, we got the producer price index. It's very important, often overlooked report, and it came in much hotter than expected. More than that, they also revised up the previous month's soft report to be hotter than it had originally come in. So what this tells me is that you cannot just look at the consumer price index and say, no, that went down, inflation's going down. In fact, PPI actually feeds into a lot of the third one, the personal consumption expenditure price index that the Fed looks at. So there's a lot of inflationary pressures here. And things like margins for wholesale machinery went up. That tells me that there's actually a lot of people buying wholesale machinery, that the manufacturers of it feels like they have pricing power. And so I don't think inflation is on a clear path to coming down the way a lot of people do. And I think the Fed will see that, and that will be a signal to them that they don't have the all clear to cut rates as early as September.
Well, then you got the CPI, which was soft in June, as you say. Excuse me. But the 12-month change is 3%. The Fed's target is 2%. The core rate is 3.3%. The Fed's target is 2%. Now, once again, every month for the last 2 years, but once again, some of these futures markets are pricing in Fed rate cuts. If the Fed wants to be serious, John, and they want to make their 2% target, then they should make their 2% target. Not 3%, but 2%. Now, last, 3.5 years, the cost of living index is up 20%. So that's, inflation has a long tail, and consumers are still rebelling against that. But what's your take on this rate cut business? And again, this is an election year. And I would think the Fed, for its own sake of independence, would want to be very careful. Because if they cut in September, Donald Trump is going to have a few things to say about this. This would not be the first time he's picked Jay Powell apart. I mean, he certainly did when I was in there in his first term. I mean, what's your read on this story?
I think that the Fed, as you were saying, knows very well that it would be putting its independence at stake by cutting in September. Because even if they could cut, let's say they can come up with a reason, a rationale, well, inflation isn't down to the target, but it's been going down, which I'll just interrupt myself and say I don't think they'll do that, because they saw inflation coming down last year, and then it rose again really rapidly in the first quarter of this year. They want to make sure they don't end up in that kind of position again, where they get kind of head faked, get ready to cut. So I think they want to see several months. But even if they did think they could cut, there's no compelling reason to cut in September. The economy's not crashing. Unemployment is still very low. So there would be no cause for it except politics. And so they would be roundly attacked, not just by Donald Trump. There were warnings when Jay Powell went this week in front of the House and the Senate committees. They warned him, don't cut, because if you do, that will cause a backlash. There's a lot Congress can do to rein in the Fed. Remember, the Fed has a dual mandate that was created by Congress. And if Congress wants to change that to depoliticize the Fed, it's well within their power. They can definitely change that.
Yeah, I see in your report, everybody wants a rate cut, said Representative Andy Barr, Republican of Kentucky. But I think a September rate cut will not be perceived as apolitical. And then my pal, Senator Kevin Cramer, Republican, you say North Carolina, actually North Dakota. But anyway, Senator Kevin Cramer issued a similar warning to Powell on Tuesday in the, whatever it is, Senate banking hearing. I mean, you're right. They're going to take a lot of heat. And you know what? In the campaign, Trump won't have to do all the lifting. Some of his supporters, right? You take a Kevin Cramer, for example, and other members of the Senate will blast the Fed. Will blast the Fed because there's no compelling reason. They haven't convinced us that they've gotten to 2. And on the other side, the labor market has not yet fallen apart. It may be weakening, but it hasn't fallen apart. So this
I think there's actually something very dangerous as well. If you look at the latest consumer sentiment numbers, they fell even though inflation has come down. But they fell very explicitly because people are depressed, as you said, by the long tail of inflation. So for the Fed to be seeming not to care about inflation right now, even though it is hurting consumer sentiment, I think actually would then give the critics of the Fed even more space to go after the Fed. And I don't think Jay Powell wants his legacy to be seen as politicizing the Fed, as perhaps endangering its independence, having a legislative backlash. Even short of passing legislation that would change the dual mandate, Congress can get these guys in as often as they need to and grill them and say, why did you do this? Produce the papers that show us why you did this. Tell us your analysis, because it seems very political. I don't think Powell wants that as his legacy. He can just wait 8 more weeks until November and cut then. He can wait till December and cut then. There's no rush to cut. So it would seem to be very imprudent to do it on the eve of the election. I don't think they will, even though, as you said, the market right now is reflecting a 100% chance, more or less, 95% that they cut in September. I think that's foolish. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, these futures markets, I mean, I'm a market-oriented guy, but these futures markets on the Fed funds rate have been wrong for a couple of years. I mean, they've just continuously predicted.
Yeah, that's right. At the beginning of the year, remember, they were pricing in 5 or 6 cuts this year. And
right.
we said that wasn't going to happen. The market prices were wrong on that. They tend to get over enthusiastic. They see some evidence for why the Fed could cut, assume there's going to be, a million cuts coming down the pipeline. Now they might get 1 or 2, but I don't think any of the cuts happen before the election. To your point on the University of Michigan Sentiment Index, it's very interesting to me. So the July number preliminary was 66.0 on the index. June was 68.2. May was 69. So it's falling. A year ago, it was 71.5. So it's way down from a year ago. But I went back and looked at some charts. John Riding and Conrad DeQuatros always do a lot of charts with these numbers. During the Trump years, you know where the sentiment index was? It was above 100.
Yes, it was pretty steady around 100. So it's like 35% less under Biden than it was during the Trump years. I mean, what does that tell you? What does that tell you?
I think it's actually one of the best polls. They always ask people, do you approve of the job the president is doing on the economy? I think this is the actual presidential job approval poll. When sentiment is down at 66, 65, as you said, 35% below where it's from, it means people are really unhappy with the economy. By the way, the Biden people agree with me on that. They know that they are in danger by low consumer sentiment. They were very much hoping that as inflation came down last year, that would start to give a boost to consumer sentiment. But as you just pointed out, we're actually below where we were a year ago. Consumer sentiment has worsened. It is getting worse for them. They're getting very desperate. That's one of the reasons, by the way, they think a Fed rate cut would help them because it would allow them to declare victory over inflation.
I don't think it'll help. You know what, John?
I don't think it'll help at all.
Right. for all the reasons you've laid out in the Business Digest, this will be seen as highly political, blah, blah, blah. It will not help them. It will backfire. It will absolutely backfire. And by the way, I got to get out. The slump in consumer sentiment, down 35 points from where it was during the Trump year. John, it's a vote of no confidence against Joe Biden and his policies. People are not confident about the future if the current administration continues. They're just not confident in it. And
that'll weigh on the economy, Larry, as we go forward. If you cannot have a thriving economy where people are, down at 66% consumer sentiment level. So that's going to be trouble. People are basically going to vote this November to reject being misdepressed about the economy.
Yeah, I think you're right. Anyway, folks, this is John Carney, Breitbart news editor on the economy, co-author of the Breitbart Business Digest. Digest comes out daily. It's a must-read, folks. John, thanks ever so much. We'll take a quick break right here. We're going to continue the economics discussion on the other side. The great Kevin Hassett, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is going to come on. Question before the House is Donald Trump's economic policies really inflationary? Well, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are writing columns that they are. We'll see. Kevin Hassett next up. I'm Kudlow. Stick around, folks.
This is the Larry Kudlow Show.